Welcome to Full Spectrum, where I bring you unfiltered stories and actionable strategies from innovators who have done wild things, all designed for you to apply in your own life. I'm Molly Kawahata, and this is my podcast. All right, welcome back to Full Spectrum. I'm your host, Molly Kawahata. Ugh, so weird. Why do I talk like a weirdo? How's everyone doing? Truly, how are we doing? I've been thinking a lot about uncertainty lately. I don't know if uncertainty is a feeling. Maybe it's more like a state. Whatever that state is, I've been feeling it for so many reasons, obviously. Like, duh. But I've had a few moments that have made me realize how weird my relationship with uncertainty is. So my friend, her and her partner were planning on moving. And then they found out this amazing news that they're having a baby. So it really changed their plans. They have family nearby. This is the town they grew up in. And so they decided they were going to stay. And at one point she told me, we might end up just staying here. Like I could see that playing out. And I go, oh, like for the rest of your life, you might be here. And I honestly meant that as a serious question. Like, of course you can predict that. And she laughed at me and she was like, what are you talking about? I'll never be able to answer that question till I'm like 80. Like, I don't know what the future holds. And I was like, oh. And what's funny is it made me reflect on the way I've thought about life changes. That I just assume that whatever my current life is, like, this is it in some way or another. And I'm just wrong every time. I'm wrong all the time. And it's like this illusion of permanence, isn't it? That we have. How it is how it's going to be. I don't know if it's like a bias, but I experienced that a lot. And I've had so many moments in my life where I've thought kind of implicitly, everything from cities to friends to my work to where I live, my family dynamic, all of it, like, this is it. I figured it out. I'm at the end in some way or another. Of course, we keep growing and changing, but like this setup is it. And I'm wrong every time. And I've started to realize instead of just thinking I know and being wrong, I could just not know. Oh, what an epiphany. I think this is what everybody else has been doing, but I don't know. For me, it's been weird. Anyway, and obviously with the state of everything going on, like things are hard. Things feel hard. Things feel deeply uncertain. And uncertainty is by definition so uncomfortable, which is why I think we create this illusion often of permanence. And that illusion is often also the basis for a lot of burnout, I think, right? It's that feeling of like, oh, look how far we've fallen. It was so great. Look how it is now. Like this sucks and this is it. And as somebody with bipolar disorder, I'm more guilty of that than all of you. Truly. Like in the moments where I feel depressed in my head, I've always been depressed and I'll always be depressed. And the moments where I'm happy, I've always been happy and I'll always be happy. Neither is ever true, right? But it feels true. It feels that way. So I'm learning to grapple with nuance and uncertainty and just accept it and like label it like this is uncertain. And when I was living in DC years ago, I went and saw a therapist. I remember he gave me feedback in kind of a harsh way, but I needed it. And he said, Molly, you need to be way more tenuous about things. And I had to look that up because I didn't know what it meant. Tenuous. It's kind of like weak. And he was getting at this idea of like uncertain. I don't know. But like you need to accept that you don't know everything because you think you know everything in your life, everything that's happening, everything that's going to happen. You think you know. And that was this moment where I realized my relationship with uncertainty needed to change, or at least honestly, I needed to like have some relationship with uncertainty because instead of living with it, and accepting it as true because it is. It's one of the most true things in the world, right? Instead of that, I just pretended it didn't exist and then was wrong, right? This is not a winning strategy. Don't recommend because it causes so much consternation and confusion and stress of like, whoa, I thought I knew and clearly I didn't. Everything's different. Well, like maybe if I had just known, hey, things are going to change or I don't know what's going to happen next in my life, that would go better. So anyway, that's part of why I created this podcast, honestly, because that's been a question I've been chasing is like, how do we deal with uncertainty in the modern world, whether it's in our lives, in our relationships, in the state of the world, and what's happening? Like, how do we work through that and manage it and try and make it better? I don't know the answers. I've never had them, but I am very curious, and that's what we're trying to do here. Okay, this episode is part 2 of a conversation with Dr. Hellman. So if you didn't listen to the last episode first, go back to that. This one won't make sense without it. And I'm going to give you a quick recap on hope so you remember where we started. 1, hope is not a feeling. It's a mindset. And that's relevant because mindsets can be learned. And the definition of hope is the belief the future can be better and that you have the power to make it better. You have the agency to make it better, right? The three things that go into hope, the hope formula, is goals, agency, and pathways, gap. And Chan will sometimes be referring to agency as willpower throughout this. Now, an oversimplification of what that means, the goal is the target, right? Where are we going? Agency is, I believe I have the power to get there. We can make that happen. And then pathways is your roadmap to get there. Goals, agency, pathways, gap. That's the formula for spreading hope. And then in this episode, you'll learn some really interesting things about hope. One of my favorites is how Chan talks about the use of storytelling and what we find from everything from children's books to movies like Top Gun, the ways in which they can be used to help us understand and learn hope in our own lives, which is fascinating, a really interesting tool. You'll hear a really cool story about how Chan actually used hope as a tool in his own life, what that looked like to get him out of a depressive period in his life, which is really powerful, I think. Oh, and we're going to talk about collective hope, which is super cool, right? So we talk about individual hope, raising your own hope level, but what does that look like in groups or organizations or nations? When we talk about collective hope in a nation, your mind might go back to somebody who was maybe president a couple terms ago. That guy, we're going to talk about Barack Obama and how he created collective hope in America, which is just fascinating to look back on. And honestly, it's like a case study in the ways he used the components of the science of hope. Whether or not he knew about them, I don't know, but he used them pretty spectacularly in order to have that effect on the nation. All right, we're going to start by introducing a story of how Chan used hope in his own life. Remember the early days of the pandemic? March 2020. When everything seemed to change overnight. No one seemed to know how long it would last or what could happen next. Suddenly, we were all living in a haze of uncertainty. That must have been a really hard time to be the world's top hope expert.
I was getting invitations all the time from different news sources. How are we supposed to be hopeful during the pandemic? And so I'm, on this video platform and I realize that I have to be high energy, right? Because I'm talking about hope. And I know it's a soundbite. And I have to tell you, about April, I started to feel like a fraud because I realized that I was starting to experience this isolation and sense of depression. And for me personally, I just said, okay, I'm going to practice what I preach. So I said, okay, I've always wanted to do a sprint triathlon. So I'm going to set that goal. And to be honest with you, I gave it two sort of descriptors. Number one, just finish. It doesn't matter if I walk. It doesn't matter. Just finish. And then the next thing was, okay, well, let's get on the internet and see what is a sprint triathlon? And, do I have access to a swimming pool? And it turns out I did, and a bicycle or a 10-speed. So
this is the pathways.
This is the pathways. And so I found a sprint triathlon training regimen of every day, for 8 weeks, what I was supposed to do. And it pulled me out, and it wasn't doing the sprint triathlon that gave me hope. It was the journey, finding a goal, beginning the steps, and then my hope began to be restored.
This is what it looks like to use hope as a tool. Since hope isn't a feeling, Chan didn't wait around for hope to show up. He actively engaged in it as a mindset. He used the gap framework to regain control and restore his sense of hope. At a time when the pandemic was happening, and I think a lot of kind of those feelings like world problems, it's a loss of agency.
Yes.
It's a loss of willpower. You're like, what do I do to fix this? We think of ourselves as kind of beholden to these circumstances, and they're kind of dictating our hope levels. So if somebody's thinking about their own life, if they encounter a situation or something that they feel very little control, what are the steps they would take at that moment in order to maintain a sense of hope?
When you and I are experiencing distress and, transitioning into maybe this lower hope space, first and foremost, what our research shows is that we're much better at short-term specific goals. So we can get overwhelmed by, all of these things that we have to do, and so much of it is out of our control. So it may be that we just lower the focus to, well, what do I have to do this week? And then another strategy that we use is, even if that is a struggle for us, is, to think about maybe a wheel, and this wheel has, let's say, 5 spokes, and each point of that spoke is a domain in our life, like work, relationship, health, hobbies. Then I can begin to focus on, okay, what is my goal in the short term for my work? And the more specific and more focused we become, the research shows it's a better predictor of actually goal attainment, but also of restoring our own hope.
So if you're in distress, if you're struggling, it's a matter of find short-term goals. That makes sense, because I think in those moments is when we're thinking the most long-term and feeling the most inadequate. And so just bringing that bar much closer.
So let's imagine a middle school where we've got school-age children who are just completely disengaged. And what I worry about is that we begin to characterize that youth as a low hope youth in general. And it may be true that their hope in the context of that classroom and that school is low. But what we've found is that while that youth may be low in hope in school, they're incredibly high hope with their friends. That is, they're really good at setting goals and finding pathways and overcoming those barriers. So, I think it's also looking at where are we really good at that? And what can we learn from that we can apply in these other domains? And then begin to look at, for instance, what is our goal at each of those domains? Begin to identify in which of these domains am I more or less hopeful? And which ones do I want to prioritize? We can give ourselves a little bit of respite from the overall pressure of maybe being in a low hope scenario in a relationship, and recognize that at least in this moment, I'm a really high hope person in my work. So number one, I am able to do these things. And how can I learn from those spaces? I have to tell you, one of the things that influences the way I think about that are treatment recovery programs for substance abuse. For instance, a 12-step program, where the hallmark of that is tomorrow doesn't matter. It's only today that matters. And I can only focus on those things that I can control today. And when I'm in incredible distress and in that chaos of craving or, substance addiction, maybe it's not today that I'm focused on, but the next 15 minutes. And, honestly, this is really personal for me. I'm 9 years sober. One of the things about substance abuse and recovery is when you're caught up in the addiction itself is the pathway to well-being. As hard as that may be for people to understand, it's the substance abuse that allows me to be well in that moment. And when I decide to go into treatment, I'm giving up well-being. My framework is that I'm going to be miserable for the rest of my life. And the beautiful thing about recovery and 12-step programs is that it really highlights the idea that hope begets hope. And it's that idea that only today matters. And if I can get through today, I can get through tomorrow. And pretty soon I have a 30-day chip. There's the social connectedness of sponsors and groups. So you're not in isolation of that. I think recovery is the hallmark of hope.
What were those moments like when you were going through this process of changing what your goals looked like through your recovery?
Yeah. So one of the things that our research shows, again, going back to the idea that my own personal experience is pretty influential in my research agendas. I'm just trying to figure it out. One of the things that we find, and it's not just in the context of recovery, when you and I are experiencing adversity and stress, it is much more natural for us to begin to set goals that are avoidant in nature. That is, we begin to set goals around outcomes that we do not want to occur. So, for instance, if my goal in that moment was to not lose my job, that's an avoidant goal. Not losing my job is a good goal. But what I want us to understand is that it comes from a place of fear and uncertainty. And while it's a wonderful place to start, we certainly don't want to stay there. So we want to find strategies that nurture hope so that we transition towards that achievement mindset.
I think it's really relevant that you brought up fear, because I think that's something a lot of people are feeling right now in a lot of different capacities. I realize too how fear is kind of an everyday emotion. Like, I don't realize these micro moments where I think about like, what does the future hold? It's like a moment of fear, as well as kind of these insidious underlying things I struggle with in my anxiety. When it comes to fear, are these opposite opposing forces, or do fear and hope coexist in some way?
Yeah, I personally see that hope and fear do coexist. Fear and uncertainty influences, again, the goals and the pathways that I'm going to consider. Let me give you a really quick example, for instance. So if you could imagine a basketball player who steps out on the court and the mindset is, I want to get the ball and shoot the winning shot for the team. That's an achievement mindset. But if I'm that same basketball player and my mindset is, I hope they don't throw me the ball because I'll probably lose it and really disappoint my team, that's an avoidant mindset. But what I want you to think about is how those two players behave on the court. What we see is that the nature of the goals drives our pathways thinking. For my specific area of focus of how does trauma and adversity impact hope, the belief that anything could be different, could be robbed from us. The belief or the expectation that I have the power to make it so. There may be such strong environmental constraints that I don't have access to the pathways that are required. And so my hope could be diminished. It really highlights the difference between hope and positivity, that just hang in there, everything's going to be better. And some of that can be, from a friend or a loved one, it can be helpful in that moment, but that's not what hope is. And hope is about taking action to navigate through that adversity.
There's nothing hope science people hate more than toxic positivity. Hope is not about looking at the bright side. It's very problem focused. That's why it's proven to get so many results, because it's so problem oriented. And also why, side note, hope is very tied to innovation. If you want to become a more innovative problem solver, increase your hope level.
I'm interested in how do we strengthen hope so that people can overcome adversity to live life well. But I'm equally as interested in how do we nurture hope so that people can live well within the adversities that they experience. It doesn't mean that we've banished all adversity and despair and distress, because we're all going to experience that. How do we create this vaccine that protects us from those adversities?
I think, honestly, like a recipe for misery is trying to avoid pain.
Mm-hmm.
You try to avoid pain because there's no way to succeed at that. And so then you're just not sure or aware of what's happening in your life. You're very much denying things that are happening around you. You're refusing to feel pain, which is making it haunt you and stick around. I think that reframe of positivity being, let me pull out the good things that are happening out of a situation, which is hard because when you're in a crisis or there's a very real problem, it's not necessarily about like the looking at the bright side, the silver lining strategy, right? Because it is true. I think positivity doesn't always get a good outcome. Mm-hmm. It can be very invalidating to people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think it is important because I think hope it runs the risk, number one, of being considered as a wish, but it also runs the risk of being this, everything's going to be better, because it may not for a long time. One of the things that you're kind of sparking for me as I'm thinking about this is this type of conversation. What we're talking about is the foundation of this kind of newer concept that I've been working on of collective hope. And, I began to think about in two different ways, really, is if individual hope is such a powerful predictor of well-being, what would collective hope look like in a community or an organization? And collective hope is not the average of everybody's hope score. Collective hope is that my leaders, my team, my group can cast a clear vision of the future. And together we can find those strategies to achieve that vision, and that there's this shared energy to pursue those goals. And I have to tell you, as I started to think about collective hope, I actually saw the connection, or at least I imagine a connection in very important social movements in our country, in our world. And, where an individual might feel like the problem and the system is so profound and big that there's nothing that I can do, and experience frustration. But when a collective starts to come around an issue and think about the power of that, and I think about things like watching the Me Too movement, for instance, of this unity, this common experience and vision. And to me, that was collective hope.
When it comes to collective hope, my head always goes to Obama and what he did. And I think about that time in America, and I think it was really trendy almost to be cynical back then. Like, it was almost a sign of intelligence. You were a realist. You saw things for what they were. And I was extremely cynical. And not only because I think I wanted to fit in, but I also struggle so much with my mental health. I was incredibly hopeless. When you look back, it really kind of shows that people don't need to be hopeful for them to really be interested in a hopeful message from someone. And I think that's such an important takeaway. They don't need to start hopeful or excited about hope or even interested in it. And what strikes me about that movement, I don't know that President Obama is at all familiar with the science of hope, but he tapped into goals, willpower, and pathways perfectly. In fact, he has a quote where he literally says,
"Hope is not blind optimism. It's not ignoring the enormity of the task ahead. Hope is that thing inside us that insists that something better awaits us if we have the courage to reach for it and to work for it and to fight for it."
I mean, is that not the exact definition within the science of hope? When you look back, it really kind of shows that people don't need to be hopeful for them to really be interested in a hopeful message from someone. And I think that's such an important takeaway for collective hope, is they don't need to start hopeful. I'm thinking a lot about Gen Z when we're talking about collective hope. And I work with them a lot. They, I think, are some of the most incredible people. I admire that generation so much. And they're very low in hope. And it's for very valid reasons, right? But they are so interested in hope when you talk about it. It's almost sometimes like people are asking for permission to feel hope.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually finding that when I go and speak to groups.
I think hope is who we are. I think at the core of what it means to be human is to be hopeful, or to have the capacity to be hopeful. And I think you're absolutely right. And our research shows that, for instance, the relationship between individual hope and collective hope is not very strong. What that may suggest is that I can be a little bit lower in my own hope, but when I'm part of something bigger, part of a social organization, there's efficiency and effectiveness when we work together towards a common goal. For me, that's what collective hope is, that we create this connectedness around this common vision.
This is key right now if you're feeling low in hope. The research shows that even if your own personal hope level is down, being part of something bigger, like a community or a collective cause, can still fuel hope. It's about finding strength in the shared pursuit of a common goal and knowing you're not in it alone.
I'm going to be really curious to see how the research rolls out with regards to climate issues and the anxiety associated with that, especially among youth.
I mean, I'm thinking so much about climate change throughout this. And the way I've fallen into this hope world was starting with talking about climate hope in that space. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do every day is restore people's sense of agency. Because that's really the missing thing. The pathways are very clear when it comes to climate on how to build the zero carbon economy. We actually already have the technology, but agency is where people feel like there's nothing I can do that has any impact. You're a part of, on that note, you've actually helped lead this national movement around hope-centered organizations. What does it mean to be a hope-centered organization?
A hope-centered organization is one where hope is the core value that guides the decision-making by which an organization operates. So we created this training curriculum for organizations that is really focused on creating a culture around hope and well-being for the workforce. And then ultimately what we call hope navigators. And hope navigators go through a 2-day pretty intensive training. And at the end, walk away with how to infuse hope into programs, policy, or products. In Oklahoma, we began working with the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, our largest state agency.
Chan's work with the state of Oklahoma got really big results. When they increased hope levels of state employees, they saw significant improvements in employee mental health, retention, recruitment, and continuities of service. Increasing state employee hope levels ultimately saved taxpayers $61 million. It's a case study in showing how hope is incredibly cost effective.
And we're now in 10 states with many other states reaching out to roll this, into their state agencies as well, and school districts and hospitals, etc. We're all working in a space where we're pretty much driven by this idea that we need to identify the adversity and reduce the adversity. It's almost like every day we're focused on what is wrong. And how do we reduce what is wrong? And the thing that I love about hope is that it doesn't ignore that question, but it says that there's maybe a better question, and that is what is right with people? And we're getting beaten down by the system that is focused on what's wrong. And what I love about hope is that, it's basically this idea that well-being is more than the reduction of what is wrong with you.
What does that look like in real life? Like, it's more than the absence of badness.
Sure.
What is present?
For me, the reduction of depression is very critical and important in our society. It is so important that we address it, that we recognize it. But I want us to understand that the reduction of depression is not happiness. And so I think we need to take a more holistic perspective, and I think hope allows that.
I'm thinking so deeply about this idea of like, if you're at -10, you're like below okay. How do you get to 0?
Yes.
That's a lot of the focus in mental health and psychology. And if you're at 0, you're like, okay, how do you get to 10?
Yes. It's the disease model of our country. But one of the things that I want to go back to is I said earlier that I think substance abuse recovery is a profound model of hope. But I also think that for the people who are going into treatment and recovery today, and not just substance abuse, imagine the bravery and the perseverance that requires and the courage. And those are important strengths that need to be celebrated as well, because it does take courage.
Absolutely. I mean, it can be a guiding framework for everybody else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
People who are models in hope to the rest of society.
Yes.
Chan explains that individuals who score high on hope still face barriers, but the difference is they tend to anticipate those barriers.
Well, higher hope individuals, again, are able to find multiple pathways to their goals. They re-goal at an easier level, but it may be, for instance, like, okay, if I'm not going to be able to pursue this goal, then I'm going to shift my energy towards this other area, this other domain of my life that also gives me meaning and purpose.
When we can't figure out the next step, Chan suggests looking around for someone who's already achieved what we want and learning from their journey. This is an effective way to form pathways.
When I took my first psychology class, I knew that psychology is what I wanted to be a part of. And in that exploration, I realized also that I wanted to be a professor, but I didn't know how to get there from here. So it really took a lot of exploration and talking to a lot of different people about, oh, okay, I've got to go to grad school. So I don't know how to go to grad, so I don't know how to do that. And so, again, I had to find those models or the social gift piece of hope. Earlier, I talked about the idea of going and doing a sprint triathlon. That for me is just such a real example of I felt myself going down kind of a bad place. And so what is the one thing I could do? And I could run, I could swim, I could bike.
Chan talks about how we can use media like books and movies to teach hope.
As I think about all of the children's movies, things like Finding Nemo and some of the other children's stories, I think that these are great strategies of hope. I actually think that every children's movie is a movie about hope because in every movie, the main character has a particular goal that they're chasing. And throughout the movie, that main character will experience a major barrier that is the crux of the movie. But ultimately, in every children's movie, the main character will overcome the barrier in some fashion. And what I've observed is that the main character always overcomes the barrier in the same way. And that is their friends, their social group in that moment all come together to help the main character overcome the barrier and ultimately achieve the goal.
It's interesting when you think about the movies and stories we grew up with. The pattern is always the same. The protagonist sets a goal. They face huge obstacles. And with the help of others, and often something intrinsic in who they are, they make it through. Even though these writers and filmmakers weren't thinking about hope in the technical sense, they were still giving us a blueprint. I also love children's book, and it's been a dream of mine to write one day. And it's so true that they're inherently hopeful. And I wonder, does that say something about the way our brains are wired for hope? That how does every single book ever written end up being a story around goals, willpower, and pathways?
Yeah. So what are they drawing that from? And I think you're right. I think it is just this basic recognition that hope is who we are. We are wired for this idea of hope. I'm kind of a big movie fan, and, there's some obvious movies like Good Will Hunting, for instance, that is, profound stories of hope. But our regular movies that we watch, whether it's, Top Gun or The Avengers, Lord of the Rings, they're all stories of hope.
It's the same story we see in Harry Potter, Forrest Gump, Spider-Man, The Lion King. It's this idea that what makes us feel other is often what makes us powerful. I think that's always really powerful for books too with children, and showing it's something innate in you and what makes you different and maybe insecure or weird, but that really can be your superpower.
Oh, man, I so love that. The power of our own individuality and how we can feel so insecure, especially in that childhood space, about being different is not good, right? And yet being different is profound. And I love that.
And isn't that interesting? It's almost like the way you frame your story is the thing that was the most painful is this incredible strength and is this example of hope. And I think for me too, it's all of these vulnerabilities and insecurities I had when I was younger and still live with. I really thought of them as this negative weakness in my life that I would love to castigate, which is living with mental illness. And this idea that it's now become something so inherent to who I am. It's an interesting reframe, basically, to realize that the thing we most try to avoid in ourselves is often our biggest strength.
Yes, I absolutely love that. Right. The other aspect of that is that when you do work and that real lived experience, it just makes hope real. It helps connect you to the story of hope. And I do think that's critical.
Which brings me to something I've been wondering lately. The world is a scary place right now. If you've questioned everything, you're not alone. And I've been wrestling with my own hope levels. So I start to wonder, how does Chan face it all without drowning in despair? When the world feels like it's falling apart, how do you cultivate hope personally?
I really shift my focus to what can I control today? The other thing is that I try to stay connected to my family and friends, that space. To me, it's really more about sort of shifting that focus from the long term to the short term of what it is that I can work towards, what are the steps that I can control and take action towards.
Remember that teacher Chan mentioned at the beginning of this episode, whose seemingly small words changed everything for Chan? Well, Chan went back 30 years later, and he found him.
And so I go back to the community, and there's a hometown basketball game, and that teacher is long retired, but is in the gym, volunteering, taking money, still connected to the school. So I go up and sat with him. And I just sat and we just talked for about an hour. And towards the end of that hour, I leaned into him the same way that he leaned into me. And it was fun because he was kind of leaning away because I was invading his space a little bit. And I just looked at him and I said, you're the reason that I'm alive today. And he looked at me so I kind of explained, what he had done in that moment. And as he responded, his response was, "I did what?" And he didn't even remember it. And I just love that. I just loved that experience because that 5 minutes out of his time is the reason I'm alive today. So I think about, imagine what that would look like if we did that with intention. And hope offers the framework for intentionality.
Spreading hope isn't complicated. It's often just a sentence, a moment. We just don't always see the impact.
I think about it again from that teacher's perspective. In that moment, he saw me, right? He saw that I was struggling. And his statement in that connectionness, in that short moment, had that profound effect. And what we find pretty consistently is that connectedness is one of the strongest predictors of hope. And so empirically, that tells me that hope is about relationships, that hope is something that happens together. I think the one takeaway is that hope is something that can be taught. It is something that can be nurtured. And the big takeaway for me is that hope provides a framework for us to be intentional about teaching and nurturing hope.
I love it. Hope, it's just like something we can tap into at any point. We don't have to wait.
Yes.
Yeah. And where can people find you?
So the website, chanhellman.com. Whenever we publish new research, I usually post that on LinkedIn. So people can certainly find me there. And then, of course, there's always the TED Talk, and hopefully within the next year, a new book.
It has been an extraordinary honor to get to sit down with you. And thank you so, so much.
Thank you. What an honor and what a joy the conversation has been for me.
My goal with this podcast is simple: to take big ideas and make them practical for you. We're going to talk about the gap analysis. This is for situations where something feels off in your life or your work. Things just aren't working, they're not moving forward, and you don't really know why. And what often happens is that we find ourselves solving for the wrong thing, right? Like how often I do that all the time. So to recap, hope is made of three things, right? Goals, agency, pathways, gap. That's the formula. So what you can do is use this formula in order to better diagnose problems and come up with better solutions or interventions. So say at work, you have a project and it's just not moving forward. And we often default in the workplace to assuming problems are goals problems, but maybe your team knows what the goal is and they get it and they're bought into it. And the real issue is that they don't actually know what to do next. So then it's actually a pathways problem, or they don't actually believe they can pull it off, right? That would be an agency issue. And I can't tell you the number of people I've worked with who have looked back and been like, oh my God, my last company, we didn't have pathways, especially people in the startup world. That's a very common reaction I get when I work with founders. So identify some problem, right? Is it a goals, agency, or pathways issue? Let me go through some questions that can help you diagnose that. The questions to ask yourself for goals is the goal feasible, desirable, and clear? Can you realistically take this on right now? Does it fit where your current life is? That's testing for feasibility. And then, does it actually excite you, or are you just chasing something because you feel like you have to? That's testing for desirability. Do you actually want this? What we know is that if it's not a goal you actually care about, you're likelier to bail on it when things get hard. We all know what that's like in some way. And then, is it something specific or actionable, or just a vague idea? That's testing for clarity. So I worked with one restaurant, and the executive chef was saying, one issue we have is that sometimes shifts are really great and sometimes they're bad, and we want to have more good ones. And so he's like, our goal's clear. And I said, wait, what goes into a good shift? And he was like, it's like vibes. You just know it or you don't. But I went further and I was like, yeah, but there are things that make it a good shift for you. What are they? So he went back to the team and they identified that there were some things that actually really made a difference. One was how many tables they turned. And two was how fast the food got out. And that determined how happy the customers were. That determined how happy they were. It really made a difference in their well-being as staff. So they found there were these two core metrics that were like determining a lot of this. It was actually a goals problem. So if any of these things are issues, you might have a goals problem. So that's the G of gap. The next thing to ask is it an agency issue? So the question you can ask yourself here is, do you believe you're in control of what happens next? And Janice talked about a person who might be low in agency. You might hear them say something like, it is what it is. It's not about having unwavering confidence, like I rarely do. It's really getting at, do I believe I have the ability to take action, overcome obstacles, and make decisions moving forward? And if not, that might mean you have an agency issue. But sometimes the issue isn't your goal or whether you believe in it, right? It's the path forward. And this is where I mega struggle. Pathways, the P of gap. Now, my whole work is the science of hope. And yet when I took the test personally to identify my own hope level, I did not score super high. And it's because I really struggle with pathways. So high hope people score really well on pathways because it becomes less about avoiding bumps in the road and more about what to do when they inevitably arise. Like they expect them, they anticipate them, they plan for them. And the other component here is that if a goal really matters to you, it's worth having multiple pathways to get there because those obstacles, they will inevitably come, right? That's part of it. That's part of the deal. And that somehow is a lesson I seem to have to learn again and again. It's like I'm surprised every time some obstacle arises. But if you ever have that feeling where you're kind of running in place, like you see your goal and you're just not getting closer, chances are that's a pathways problem, and that's the P of gap. Okay, so let's make this less abstract for a second. How many times in relationships have we thought, we need to communicate better, right? So common. And say both people are totally aligned on that goal. And they're both motivated. They both want that to happen, right? So the goal is clear and the agency is high. And then often it's like, oh, like we're still not communicating better. We know from experience, like you can't just want it. That's not always enough to change. Like what do we actually do? What strategies did we deploy to break our old habits and communicate better and change how we interact? So oftentimes in relationships, we're actually dealing with pathways issues because we can identify the problems. And people who care about each other, they both want to change, but the roadmap to get there is often missing. So if you did a gap analysis in that scenario, it would be a pathways problem, the P of gap. We also know, as Chan said, high hope couples are associated with higher relationship satisfaction. They're at lower risk for breakup or divorce. To recap, 1, identify something that's not working. 2, is it a goals, agency, or pathways problem? Once you zero in on the actual issue, then you'll know specifically what to address, and the solutions become a lot more obvious. The different ways we intervene on goals, agency, and pathways, that could be its own podcast, and we will get into that moving forward. But for example, when it comes to pathways problems, Chan's number one go-to, he said, was find somebody who's done it. Seems pretty straightforward. I put together a newsletter with all the stuff I've had to learn the hard way and all the strategies I use in my own life. It's called What I Wish I Knew. It'll also include all the how-tos we break down here on the podcast. I also share behind the scenes moments, visuals, and photos from the stories, and whatever else is on my mind. Sign up at mollykawahata.com/join, JOIN. Try it out. You can unsubscribe anytime. And if this episode made you think of someone, send it their way. Some of the most helpful podcasts I've ever heard came from a friend who recommended an episode. And finally, I've got one ask for you. Hit the follow button and leave us a 5-star review. It helps us grow the show and bring on more of the guests you'll want to hear from. All right, there's more to come. I'll see you in the next episode.